Welcome to Mindful AI, the podcast that delves into the world of AI and its responsible use and development. With the advent of generative AI, the world has been captivated by the possibilities, which has sparked hopes and fears about the potential impact on society. In this podcast, we'll explore the latest advancements in AI technology, talk to people who have been in AI and their thoughts and feelings around it. And we'll explore ways to develop and use AI mindfully and responsibly. My guest today is Ed Cooke, who is a grandmaster of memory, entrepreneur, author, and co-founder of several notable platforms and communities, including Memrise, Sparkleverse, and recently Sonic Sphere, a new kind of real-world art platform. Ed is widely recognized for his pioneering work in memory and his unique approach to learning, as well as his musings on consciousness, how the mind works, and how humans perceive, process, and use information. I'm excited to speak with Ed today to discuss his insights in these topics and how it relates to the development of AI, how we can create AI systems that are more mindful, empathetic, and human-centered. Ed's expertise in this area can be really useful in informing the development of AI systems that are more attuned to human needs and values. We'll also be talking about his experiences as an entrepreneur and his journey in tech and startups and how AI is influencing the way he creates. So let's welcome Ed to the podcast. Ed, welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. What a joy.
Yes, it's so delightful. I know we have known each other for some time now, but we're in other sides of the world. So it's just so great to be able to speak to you on this very current topic. So Ed, can you give me a bit of a brief background on your interest and experience with AI?
I have been interested in the human mind and consciousness since I was a teenager. And then, you know, coming out of my teens, I went to study philosophy and psychology at university, where I was quickly captivated by accounts of the very early AI systems that have subsequently gained great prominence. The early examples of what's called deep learning. And it was quite interesting to record this because this was sort of 20 years ago. And at that point in time, there was an awful lot of debate in cognitive science departments about what the best way of thinking about the brain and the mind was. And so one sort of angle on this was that the only way to account for human intelligence and the way we use language and so on was to think of our brains as formal symbol manipulation machines. And then there was this other way of thinking, which was kind of based on these early neural networks, which placed humans in what I found was a kind of more attractive and dynamic and kind of fluid shape. And, this was a tradition called ecological psychology, which I really loved, which, held that humans were intermixed with the world, that there was no clean dividing line between our brains and our bodies and the world. And the cognition and consciousness emerged from our interaction with the world in this very organic fashion. And there were these connectionist networks, which enchanted me at the time, which showed in miniature this rather lovely way of thinking about human memory, first of all, that I could recognize myself. And at this time, I'd got an interest in memory techniques. And memory techniques actually date back to ancient Greece. But they're basically practical ways of remembering things more effectively, and we can dive into how they work. But one of the key elements of memory techniques is to think of all human memories as inherently interconnected with each other, not separated out, but sort of overlapping and sort of composted and layered one on top of the other. And it was these sort of early forms of deep learning, connectionist networks as they were called at the time, that seemed to represent a form of human memory that I could really recognize, from my own experience. One where, if you meet someone called Jane and someone called June and someone called Joanne and someone called Jill and someone called Joanna in short succession at a party, the overlap between those names was going to create competition in your mind and then confusion, leading to it being a bit more difficult to remember them.
Mm-hmm.
And things like that, which anyway, so that was how I got into it. And I think there's something very interesting about the form of AI that has come to be effective, deep learning rather than more classical forms of symbol manipulation, which is that it's actually very human. Baked into it is this very organic set of dynamics. And just to name a few of those things, in human memory, when we remember something, we're kind of reactivating the state the original event caused in our minds. So there's some sort of overlap between, we're almost taking ourselves back to that moment in time. But in doing so, we actually change the memory, because whenever we touch a memory, it morphs in connection with the new experience. And then there's this other element, which is that memory and hallucination are kind of interconnected, because when we recall something, we're imagining it again, and memory and imagination are very intertwined. And so these very human elements are some of the elements we're now seeing in generative AI, a tendency towards blurring imagination and factual recall, this inherent creativity, and the role of memory in all forms of perception, which is super interesting. Anyway, so that was my way in, and I think my beginning point in thinking about contemporary AI progress is that we found a way to capture and automate the human mind, or human mind-like things, in a way that is quite beautiful.
Yeah, that's so interesting, the parallels you draw between where AI is today and just how it relates to the very human-like nature of forming memories, imagination, and learning. So where is it that...
There's one thing to add to that, which is that I think it really shows that the classical view of the mind was that, like, you have perception, which is information input. And then you have and so you'd form a picture of the world, and then you'd match that to a memory, which would be separate. And then the memory would maybe add something to this representation. That would go into, anyway, everything was very separated out. And what you see with these networks is the perception itself is full of memory. Like, what we see in the world is dependent on the training. And we know this from our own experience. If you spend hours and hours reading books and exploring gardens and learning the names of plants and so on, and you go out into a garden, of course, where other people just see plants, you see this very richly differentiated world of things. And this is a really key and interesting point, which really can help us understand ourselves better, which is that the distinctions we're able to make in the world depend on the sedimented memories of our training. And therefore, and in this sense, the world is a projection of our own knowledge, but it's more like that. It's not even a projection. It's more like it's something which falls into resonance with our own knowledge. And this is why I'm always frustrated when there's talk of AI bias, because AI bias as a kind of conceptual framework seems to indicate that there's an objective way of seeing things, but one can be biased into a subjective way if one doesn't train the network with objective data. But actually, it's a much richer picture than that. It's just like every network and every human mind has a perspective which comes from their experience. And therefore, and of course, from a narrow view, you can say, okay, this is biased in this direction or that way. But actually, what we're talking about is an incredibly rich field of different ways minds can be attuned to the truth of the world. And I think this gets into the aesthetic and moral concerns of what is it to design cool AI systems? Which aspects of reality do we want to manifest? Do we want them to attune to? Yeah.
Right. I guess on that thought, how do you envision the future of AI then? And what role do you think it will play in shaping our world, shaping society?
Well, I do think it's extremely fun and quite difficult to think about. But my go-to framework is really that a network is basically a mind, which is to say, we're used to the concept of recording people's minds going back years and years. And so, for example, let's take the musical genius of Beethoven. And you might observe Beethoven improvising live on the piano, and you say, okay, well, that's a pure version of Beethoven. But then there's another version of Beethoven where Beethoven will practice and practice and practice and prepare a whole piece and go to a concert and play. Blah, blah, blah. And so that's, in a way, it's still the pure genius of Beethoven, but it's really kind of condensed because he kind of prepared this thing and designed it. And then we say, okay, well, Beethoven writes it down. And the written down Waldstein sonata, whatever, is in a way a condensation of Beethoven's mind, which can then travel through time. So you can send copies of that off all over Europe and the world, and different people can play Beethoven. And then you have like a recording. So like Beethoven wrote the stuff down, send it across Europe. Some person who's learned in the context of a piano playing culture to play it, that person plays it and records it. And then we got this recording, which is very distant from Beethoven's original mind, but that recording can then be played in different homes and AirPods and so on and so forth around the world. And so in a way, if we think of these things as artifacts that express the genius of a mind, we're quite used to these things being commoditized or changed, their form changing. And what kind of generative AI now allows us to do is sort of teach a network to, basically to sort of make the network learn again and again and again in every different possible form, the works of Beethoven, so that in the way that memory is very creative, it can then begin to spew new music in the style of Beethoven. And to my mind, that is just another example of the condensation of a mind into a system or artifact, and doesn't necessarily challenge the humanity of what that system produces. In other words, you can still think of that as the work of Beethoven, but just expressed through this new form of creative memory. But the challenge comes in is that these systems are just so vast and can absorb so much that you can actually feed these systems all of music, not just Beethoven. And then they can creatively conjure music like Beethoven, like Mozart, like Stevie Wonder, like da, 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 da. And I think this is where these systems, one begins to think, oh dear, they can begin to into something beyond human, because they're like an encyclopedia which has captured all of the minds.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely great potential there. I guess, what would you see as potential challenges and risks of that kind of development?
Well, I mean, I think that the fun of it, just as to carry on there, is that it's almost like the AI as a tool becomes a medium or vehicle through which any human being can, in a way, attain the talent or express themselves with the talent of Beethoven or Mozart or anything else. So it's almost like it helps us not have to spend 20,000 hours in music school to be able to craft creative things of amazingness. And that's pretty cool. And, as my friend Fabian, who runs a cool generative AI startup, likes to say, the fun is in the creativity. So it almost moves the enjoyment of music, in this case, away from reception and more towards production and creativity, which sounds pretty amazing to me. And so you can say, okay, well, this is an amazing thing. It increases the talent of every individual so that all of us can touch the genius within and express amazing things. So that's going to be pretty cool. And I think that is one way the future could go. And there's reasons to believe that it won't go that much further than that, because all of these systems, we talk about artificial intelligence, they're basically artificial memory, right? They've remembered in a very human-like brain all of music, and then they can just conjure and create and recall all of music. And so including the bits which aren't actually in the music, the bits in between two different pieces of music, and so you can prompt it and conjure it in different ways. And so in a way, it's not that much of a threat, because, once it's learned all the music, where does it go from there? Once it's absorbed all the text on the internet, does it ever get lots of incremental ways of maybe getting it to almost the level of the very finest humans? But at the same time, it's not going to go beyond, because it's a memory network. Everything is constrained within the example set that it's trained on, arguably. But it gets concerning when we have, human minds, at the level of a human being, which take a thousandth of a second to do a year's human work. And then when you string these systems together, and let's face it, a lot of human jobs, including very creative and powerful jobs, are in many ways the rigorous implementation of knowledge which has been handed down. If you're doing a startup, you read all the essays on how to do a startup, and you try and be disciplined, and you try and it's not very far off in imagination to say, okay, well, I'll string a few of these models together, and they're going to be a bunch more disciplined than I am, you're going to make these things, and then suddenly you've got an agent that can do the value creating things that a human being can do, but perhaps more effectively, and certainly like a million times faster. And then they begin to collaborate with each other, and then they go off to the races, and then people get concerned, like, what role are humans going to play in this caboodle anymore? Yeah, I'm not generally a doomer on this stuff, but I can't claim to be able to clearly see that won't take place unless we're careful.
For sure. Yes, I've certainly heard your sound bites, like it's cool, fun, and then, there's that, like, who knows? So what are your thoughts on developing AI that has a focus on human needs, values, and mindfulness? Or should it even have that focus?
Well, I mean, one thing to say, I was on my honeymoon at Angkor Wat, that place in Cambodia, that amazing set of ancient city and temples and the rest of it. And I was wandering around, and I've been reading a lot about generative AI. I was looking at all these spectacular buildings, and I was thinking, well, why does it seem like a spectacular and unachievable achievement to have such magnificent, thoughtful, beautiful, crafted architecture? And you look at the finest piece of furniture and just the quality of the woodwork and how it's all put together and so on and so forth. And you think of all the world's problems, which require a lot of activity, like all the plastic in the oceans and and you think, well, there's an awful lot that if you really had, like, if you do thought experiments, if you say, okay, I've got 1 million human intelligences at my command, well, what would I have them do? Well, I'd have them research why reflexology is so shockingly amazing feeling, for example, or, the history of parties, or I'd have them build cities of extraordinary beauty, and I would have them devise educational programs that really help people discover their enthusiasms, or, and so there's a lot of, I mean, the world's not that good, and there's a lot of cool stuff which could be done if one had immense amounts of creative intelligence applied to the world. And so that's the framework which you can see a sort of optimistic side. And here's another framework, which is that I'm a bit skeptical of the concept of superintelligence, because superintelligence almost forgets the role of knowledge. If you're sort of, if you don't have a microscope, you can be as intelligent as you like, and you're not going to be able to understand how the internal dynamics of a leaf work. You can have like 1 trillion computers in your brain, but if the information is not there, it is not going to make any difference. But you can also be quite dim with knowledge to hand and actually understand stuff very deeply. And like, take, for example, gravity. It took human beings 5,000 years to work out the basics of gravity, that planets and apples and, are subject to the same laws. It's based on mass, and then eventually that it bends space-time and so on. And, it took sort of incredible geniuses to advance that stage of knowledge. But once that knowledge has been advanced, you or I in a few hours can understand it. And so there's this huge asymmetry between the computational intelligence required to create knowledge and then to be able to make use of it. And so I think there's a very plausible future where, with the aid of incredibly intelligent systems, we create knowledge that we can all understand and make use of, and to perceive what's going on in the world better. And the fact is the world is not sort of infinitely complicated. That I actually, like, our minds seem actually quite capable of understanding the dynamics of the world, and you can see a very impressive continuum of expanding understanding. And so this idea of like, oh shit, that we're going to have creatures which are 1 million times smarter than us, I don't think it means that they understand 1 million times more about the world.
Right.
They might be more capable of generating new knowledge that can be fed down. But who knows?
What about the case of fake knowledge? Because AI is in hallucination stage, and also it's being instructed by people who are saying, create this thing that maybe doesn't exist. So there's deep fakes and then fake news and all of that. And then it's been increasingly hard to discern at the human level what's real and what's not. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't know of any examples of like AI generated fake stuff that has sort of taken over more than just human generated fake stuff. So like, it's not like AI created swathes of fake news. I mean, I think it could potentially weaponize, a ill-thinking individual's ability to confuse other people. But it's interesting. We've had like generative image AI of almost photographic quality for, a few years now, but no one's like, oh,
Now we've got video quality.
But now we got video quality, but I don't actually know of any examples of people. I mean, I think there were little things on sort of TikTok where people are like, oh, it's an alien landing or what have you. But we adjust very quickly to thinking, okay, well, this might be fake. So I'm not wildly worried about that from an AI perspective. I mean, I think that the problem is already there in sort of how restricted media environments can affect people's perception of the world.
Right.
And
I guess it's just greatly
it's interesting. I mean, I kind of like, I mean, on the other hand, like, it's clearly a thing that it's no longer the case that you can look at any piece of text or image and know that it comes from another human being, which is crazy, which is a very interesting situation to find ourselves in. But I think we adapt. I mean, funny enough, like my new project Sonic Spheres is, it's this with this real world spherical concert halls where you're in a space with 250 people and you're very much there with other people. I think part of the reason why I think there's appetite for this type of experience now is that we're maybe a bit exhausted, by a media environment that is a bit unreal in the sense that we don't really understand what comes from whom and whether it's a genuinely human artifact and so on. So I think humans adapt, in the same way that like people who I've got friends who like turn off as soon as they think it's CGI in a film. They're like no longer interested. Right. But then often something will come in and it'll be almost in the reputation of the film. Oh, this is all filmed with actual stuntmen or whatever. Right. And then that becomes exciting by itself. So it's almost the narrative around it then infuses the artifact with its power. So, it's complicated stuff. But going back to the kind of the bad stuff, I think that the human generations, I think, have always faced radical novelty, especially in the last sort of 500 years. And often like there's a vast overestimation of how far technology will go. I remember reading about the early days of hot air balloons where Victor Hugo, who's like a great European intellectual, thought that because of hot air balloons, national boundaries would soon be dissolved because now you could fly between countries in the air. There was no point having a border and therefore world peace would emerge, sort of thing. And then now that seems a bit ridiculous. And so anyway, so there are examples of that, but you don't know if this one is perhaps bigger than all the others put together because of the possibility that it'll feed back on itself and kind of go blah, 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 and then suddenly we'll be embedded in systems of which we have no understanding.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing from my perspective. All right, so what thoughts do you have, or what advice would you have for individuals and businesses who want to incorporate AI into what they're building, their daily lives? I guess going back to how you said it can be funneled into such great things like how to solve the world's environmental problems and how to build great works of art and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good to have like mental models for how to kind of create cool stuff with it. And I find useful the idea that if you say, okay, AI right now is about, as clever as a human, but very fast. You say, well, if you had an infinitely patient human who was intelligent and who, where you normally do a box and arrow diagram, instead you could put a human being in there. And, how would you design your system if you could have human level intelligence as the component? Which is kind of a bit like how you might design a company today, where you got human level intelligence of various things, and it's all connecting together. And then I think, another heuristic is sort of, or another lens is to get away from this notion of like intelligences and minds on a kind of linear scale where you got like, amoeba, squirrel, human being, super intelligent AI, but instead think of these systems of implementing a mind. And a mind isn't just like intelligence. It's like, well, what aspects of the world does it connect to? What are its goals? What's its style? What's its personality? What's its dynamics? And then, and this is like a kind of expansion. I think that the good thing about discourse around AI bias is that it does connect to this point, right? Which is that there are many possible minds we could implement. Let's implement cool ones, which is to say sort of tolerant and open-minded and interested ones. And that's the kind of product challenge something like OpenAI faces, is that they're sort of very understandably and very ingeniously, they found ways to constrain the outputs of their system from being too obnoxious. But at the same time, it's like, it feels like, your boss is over your shoulder the whole time, correcting any deviations. And so it feels a bit Orwellian. But, the way when you can have a friend or a love interest, and you're kind of walking around town with them, and they've got a kind of a particular way of perceiving the world. They spot different things, they're intrigued by different things, they will make different decisions. They're like, oh, cool, there's a guy playing a trumpet under a tree, let's go and hang out with him, etc. And your day emerges differently as a result of that, their mode of perceiving the world. Well, I think you can sort of think the same thing about the design of our AI decision-making systems or communication systems. Like, you can think, okay, well, let's say I've got a language tutor. And this is a kind of subject I thought a lot about with Memrise, the language learning app I co-founded. And, if you think back into the real world, what's a great language teacher? Well, it's not just an intelligence question. It's about spirit. It's about how the aspects of a culture and a language that they make vivid, how they push you, how they inspire, and so on. And a great teacher can range from like a friend with whom one goes on an adventure in a country with, to an amazing author, to a schoolmasterly teacher, to a kind of zany tutor who, to like a sequence of YouTube videos, which etc. And so there's a wide range, and so I think there's a wide field of things that these technologies allow us to create. In a way, we're talking about like personalization, but what kind of, I don't really love that term, because a great teacher is personalized in the sense that they perceive me, and they perceive you, and they perceive like all your motivations and dynamics and so on are, but they're not personalized in the sense that they're like adapting purely to you. They're also bringing their own vision. They're also bringing their own enthusiasm, and that's actually often what one recognizes. So I think that's kind of part of the fun of it, and part of the hope is that we can actually have a richer diversity of kind of models out there.
Ed, is there anything that we haven't touched on today related to mindfulness in AI development and use that's top of mind for you that you want to?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I suppose like if we think of consciousness and the situations where people feel the very richest consciousness, it's not normally when they're being their most complicated and intelligent. Often, actually, the richest consciousness is a very pure feeling of simplicity.
Profound.
And so I say there's almost two ways one could go with this thought. One of which is to sort of talk about whether these AI systems, one could meaningfully talk about them being conscious at some point in time. But the other way, which was kind of where I began the thought, was that what we value in human life, in the human mind, isn't really about intelligence per se. And intelligence is actually quite a new concept, so late 19th century concept, which actually emerged historically in quite kind of a particular situation. It was like Darwin's eugenicist cousin, Francis Galton, was first to sort of push the concept of intelligence, and it's got a bit of a dubious, intellectual history, where the motivation to find this thing which is distinctive and valuable in a human brain, which can be put onto a scale, almost the tail wagged the dog a bit with that, to give us this very, in the contemporary world, a very kind of strong sense that intelligence is what is important about human beings and what makes us distinctive. But another kind of approach would be to say, well, actually, intelligence is no more important than strength or speed in what makes us humans. We are strong, we are fast, we are intelligent, but it's not like that which is valuable. And in the same way that, like, you look at a skyscraper and oh my God, the steel in this skyscraper is so much stronger than a human being. I thought humans were strong. This shows us that we're weak. Oh no, what are we going to do with ourselves? You could actually do the same thing with super intelligent beings, to the extent that that even makes sense. But like, let's say there's a system which can, like a weather forecasting device, take in a number of inputs which a human being never could and understand what's going to happen next with the weather. Well, that's cool. But I tell you what's also cool, perceiving the mysterious beauty of the color yellow, whatever, or expressions of kindness or whatever, to other people. And so, to be honest, like, I mean, I think in all these responses I'm giving to your provocative questions, I don't think I'm really kind of succeeding or even trying to make a very strong argument that it's all going to be fine, or that it's this way or that way, but rather just to kind of suggest that the field of possible ways of understanding it is quite wide. We don't know, and there's certainly room for a hell of a lot of creativity in how we react and adapt. And then sort of going back to your concept of mindful AI, a mindful AI is one which might kind of increase a person's mindfulness. And I think that's what's happening with some of this generative image AI. It kind of it increases a person's visual imagination, because where before they have an intuition, I kind of got this vague sense of a battle by a stone castle with horses and mist, and you can now kind of conjure that. They say, how am I conjure that, and you kind of become a genius. And that's quite
cool. Very cool. All right, Ed, I've got two snack-sized questions to wrap us up for today. What are your favorite AI tools or any up-and-coming AI-related things that has captured your imagination? What are those things to look out for?
Well, I think that, the AI project I admire the most is probably Midjourney. So that's an image generation thing. There's many things to love about this. One of which is that the company has about 20 people in it. So it's a very small team, bootstrap. They haven't got like $100 billion from Microsoft.
Yeah, I didn't realize that.
So they're a super small team, and they're kind of very intention driven, very, taking no outside investment, and they really have, vision to enhance people's creativity, and they're succeeding in that very well. And then there's this kind of up and coming tool still in private beta, which has been created by a friend of mine called Glyph, which basically kind of the intention of it is to allow anybody to very simply kind of move blocks around and connect together different AI systems. And so I think the far version of it is that, someone will have created, a module which is like Martin Scorsese, and said, okay, I want Martin Scorsese to direct a short film about 4 girls on bicycles robbing a bank in, music by John Williams, boom, and then you get these amazing artifacts. And so like this kind of stringing the tools together to create these extravagant possibilities of creativity. And so that's very exciting to me.
Well, final question. Who or what do you follow for AI updates?
So the kind of researcher who I kind of admire the most historically is Jeff Hinton, who interestingly, by the way, has just in recent news, and he's he's such a brilliant intellect and just such a pure thinker. He spent 40 years researching neural networks, driven by this very intuitive sense of how the human mind is. It seemed to him super obvious that the mind was not a simple processor, and so he kind of driven by intuition, he did this beautiful research and really stuck with it, etc. And amazingly, he's just quit Google to say, actually, I want to talk about AI safety. So that's a wake-up call to me, because he's not an over-the-top person at all. He's a very subtle intellect and sort of dignified character. I think it's quite difficult, to be honest. There's so much excitability and noise. I've actually got quite bored of even looking at Twitter, because it's always like there's always some tweet going, AI is moving so fast. Here are 10 breakthroughs which happened this weekend. Look up these tools or will be left behind. And there's a sense that like, and yes, there are lots of sort of technical advances, but I don't agree that we all have to be panicked in sort of trying to keep up with these things. And so in terms of following things, I think it's actually worth going back to, because in a way, what's happening here is something that's happened a couple of times before, which is that we've got a very visceral sense that our minds are made of matter. Does these systems sort of like bring it home that like all of this thought and magic and consciousness and the rest of it is somehow conjured up by the dynamics of matter. And so, you can read philosophical accounts from this time of like Coleridge, where people are like, is it really possible that all of this magic could come from this thing? And I think those are quite fun to go back to. In terms of sort of thoughtful, not too over the top technical intellects, I quite like Andre Karpathy, who was head of AI at Tesla for a while and is a sort of thoughtful character who's obviously a technical genius, and I quite enjoy him. And I think, in a way, like the person who saw earliest the opportunity to build AGI is Denis Hassabis at DeepMind. And sort of DeepMind in some sense is sort of not as flashy and as in the popular culture as OpenAI, but what DeepMind, their kind of vision and what they set about doing, I think is really, really incredibly awesome, which is to augment human intellect in the service of science and knowledge. And so, heard of the protein folding stuff and things, which is like really cool application to actually scientific discovery and so on. And, I think down that path, think of what happens when you're trying to design a new bicycle or whatever. You make thousands of maneuvers in your head. You go, if I twist this here and I move this up here and I go, blah, 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 you go through all this stuff. And I think there's a world where all of those mental maneuvers become, like this image generation stuff available to anybody, so that we can like invent new things. And I think DeepMind are kind of spiritually down that path, and therefore follow them. Yeah,
that's awesome. Well, Ed, really valued just your wealth of knowledge, your way of thinking about things. I think it's brought a really interesting layer of how we can perceive AI now and then into the future. So thank you so much for joining me.
Enjoy to be on the podcast. And I think it's such a fun and timely theme. And I think you'll be able to produce hundreds of really valuable episodes exploring these topics. It's actually the theme that will probably most affect our lives over the course of the next sort of 20 years and maybe for the next ever. I think it's a really cool topic just for actually just kind of encountering human beings, our choices, what we want to do with our lives. So very excited for the series.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Deb. Ciao.
Thank you for tuning into Mindful AI. I hope that our conversation has provided you with valuable insights and perspectives on the fascinating developments in AI. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite platform. Also, don't hesitate to reach out to us on social media or via our website at Center Meditation to share your thoughts and suggestions for future episodes. Thanks again for listening to Mindful AI, and we look forward to bringing you more insightful conversations in the future.